supporters, it seems the government may have misled the entire parliament and the country on the issue of electoral bonds. Yes, and I will show you why I say this, or why I am suspecting what has happened here. So listen to this very, very carefully, viewers. If you've been following our coverage closely, you would know the issues that Mirror Now and The Last Word have raised about electoral bonds. We believe these are an opaque way of raising funds for political parties, and they reverse any progress that we may have made in the last few years in terms of clean, transparent political funding. We have brought to you views of at least 5 former chief election commissioners who have red flagged the fundraising tool, who have spoken up against it. In fact, former CEC O.P. Rawat, who just last month gave charge to his successor, said in an interview, and I quote, "Prima facie, none of our concerns have been addressed. That there are many grey areas in electoral bonds." Former CEC O.P. Rawat said, "How can you be sure what is coming in isn't black money? Prima facie, it appears that the scheme cannot deliver on what it intended to." And the operative part in that interview being that the government did not address the concerns that were raised by us. Now, that's evidence number 1. In my hand, I hold evidence number 2. This is a letter that was written by the Secretary of the Legislative Department in the Ministry of Law and Justice. This letter, viewers, is dated 26th of May 2017. Much before the electoral bonds were implemented, 4 months after the announcement was made by the government. This letter refers to an amendment in the Representation of People Act that take our electoral bond funds out of the ambit of reporting under the contribution report. The letter says that this action is a retrograde step that must be withdrawn immediately. It then goes on to speak about various changes that the government has made in relation to electoral bonds that allow for funding via shell companies, and that it would lead to increased use of black money. Not my words, these are the words of the Election Commission to the Government of India in May 2016. Having sufficiently established to you now that the Election Commission has been concerned about the changes in law that have been brought along for electoral bonds for political parties, let me show you what the Finance Ministry has told the Rajya Sabha, has told our Parliament. In a question that was asked by Nadimul Haq, a TMC MP, he asked the details for electoral bond scheme. He asked for details of the electoral bonds that have been purchased so far. He asked how much money had been raised. He asked whether it is a fact that Election Commission has raised concerns on the issue of electoral bonds. If so, what are the details and what are the reasons therefore, and what are the steps that the government has taken to address these concerns? The answer from the Ministry of Finance is there from Mr. Radhakrishnan, and in the last page of this answer it says, Election Commission has not raised any concerns on the issue of electoral bonds. Now, what are we missing here? That's the big question. Is there something in the fine print? Is there something in the legal jargon? Is there some kind of technicality, some kind of wordplay that we are not getting? Or did the government mislead the parliament here? Let's understand from one of the top lawyers in our country. Prashant Bhushan, senior lawyer for the Supreme Court, joins us this evening. Mr. Bhushan, help us understand, how can it be that Election Commission has written a letter to the government, which is in the public domain, that the Law Ministry itself has forwarded that to the Finance Ministry, which is also in public domain via RTI, yet the Finance Ministry is telling the Rajya Sabha that we've not received any concerns?
Yeah, well, it's very, very clear that the government wanted to introduce an anonymous source of electoral funding instead of bringing in more transparency, instead of putting the parties under RTI, which is what the Information Commission had ruled, the government went exactly the opposite way of introducing anonymity in political funding by allowing large-scale anonymous donations to be given to political parties, through which you could even give kickbacks. So, for example, if a government gives a contract, say the Rafale deal, is given to this Dassault company. Dassault company sets up a subsidiary in India, and through that subsidiary they can give any amount of money back to the BJP, which would be a kickback, but nobody would come to know who has given that money, and nobody would come to know that actually a kickback has been given. So therefore, and that is why you see 95% of the funding from electoral bonds has gone to the BJP. The rationale that was given by the government was that people are afraid, or corporates are afraid to make their donations known, because they are afraid that the government will pursue them if they make donations to the opposition parties. But here we find that 95% of the electoral bond funding has gone to the ruling party itself, and therefore that logic of the government, that corporates are afraid because of being victimized by the government, falls flat here, because most of the funding has been given to the government in any case. So therefore, what they wanted to do was just to introduce this anonymous source of political funding through which kickbacks can be received by the party in power, since they were in power. So they did this.
But Mr. Bhushan, what I'm now unable to understand is why would the government say that the Election Commission has not raised any concerns with us? Am I missing something in terms of a technical language? Because the letter, and I've read the letter by the Election Commission to the Law Ministry again and again, the letter goes into each change in law that was made, whether it was a change in law that was being made to the Representation of the People Act, whether it was a change in the law that was being made to the Income Tax Act about cash donations, whether it was a change in the law to Companies Act, which removed the cap for funding by and donations by the companies. Is it because the letter, it doesn't in as many words say we have issues with electoral bonds that the government has said this, or is the government not concerned about misleading the parliament?
No, government is quite happy to mislead the parliament. They have no compunctions about misleading the parliament. They have indeed no compunctions about misleading the court also. As we saw in the Rafale case, that they gave a secret unsigned note in a sealed cover to the government, in which they said that the CAG report has been tabled has been sent to the PAC, that the PAC has in fact tabled that report in parliament, a redacted part of it in parliament, and thereafter parliament has put it in public domain. Each one of these statements was false, but it was made in the secret note by the government to the court. So therefore, this government has no compunctions about lying, whether they lie to parliament. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister, in a reply on this RTI, said that these RTI amendments do not affect do not have any social impact, and therefore no consultation is needed with parliament on these amendments to the RTI, by which they are eroding the autonomy of the information commissioners, by which they are making the information commissioners virtually servants of the government, by saying that their salary and their tenure will be decided by the government. So this government has no compunctions whatsoever about lying to parliament, about lying to the court, about lying to the people. They feel that it is par for the course, so long as they can get away with it.
The Election Commission said a few weeks ago, Mr. Bhushan, that they are right now auditing the contribution reports that have been submitted by the political parties. But can we expect anything on electoral bonds, considering that the donors still remain anonymous?
No, Election Commission will not come to know anything about the donors who have donated through electoral bonds. Only the government can come to know from the banks from where these bonds have been issued. So only the government knows, nobody else knows, and yet the argument of the government was that, well, electoral bonds are necessary because otherwise donors to opposition parties can be harassed by the government.
Yes.
Even today they can harass these people because the government will know.
Yes.
But only the government will know. Even the Election Commission will not know who are the donors.
Yes, that's absolutely the big point, because the government and that by its own indirect admission have made that very clear, because they very clearly say that since it is a digital transfer of funds, the banks will have all the KYC details, the banks will know who is subscribing to these election bonds, electoral bonds, and then who is encashing it. So all the data is available, it's completely transparent. The fact of the matter is, viewers, all this data is only available to the banks, to the state-owned public sector banks that are run and owned by the government. So the government of the day will know which party is getting how much money from which corporate or group. But you and I, as the voters of this country, the Election Commission that is in charge of political funding and holding elections in this country and everything else related to the electoral process, will never know who is donating to our political parties. And now, over and above that, it seems that the government is trying to mislead the parliament. One can only hope, which is why we are raising this issue here again and again on Mirror Now, that the government comes out and offers an explanation into that written reply that has been submitted in the Rajya Sabha. The Finance Ministry saying in as many words that the Election Commission has never raised an issue. Former Election Commissioner has given an interview saying that the government never addressed our concerns. So is this another typo? Is this another misinterpretation of the English language by somebody? I don't know, but I would want the government to give us a clarification. Thank you, Mr. Bhushan, for joining us and giving us your expertise, your expert view on this big story.